Utilities folder. 18 apps. 13 new items. Double tap to speech off.
What's going on, everyone? This is Political Ideas and Thoughts, and I'm not going to really be talking anything super political on this episode, but I'm going to be making some observations about polls that you may not realize, and probably why you shouldn't, well, maybe not necessarily why you shouldn't trust polls, but why you should take polls with a grain of salt. So I was going to do some other videos a couple weeks ago, but then I decided to wait on those for a little bit. I'm probably going to wait even longer now because a lot of things have gone insane. There's a lot of escalation and whatnot going on, so I'm not going to be doing those for a while, but I decided to do this because I do think it's an important thing to talk about, because it doesn't really I don't really think that there are videos talking about this, and I do think it's important to explain this because you don't really hear this very often. So here is why you shouldn't necessarily trust polls, or why you should take polls with a grain of salt. And I'm going to start with the obvious reasons first. The obvious reasons are because of the fact that the polls themselves could be... Okay, so think of it this way. So say you have 20,000 people who take this one poll, and say about 18,000 of those people are aligned with a certain political party. I'm not going to say they're specifically Democrats or Republicans or anything, but let's just say that they're with this particular party. Okay, so the results are going to be misaligned with what actual Americans are actually thinking or whatever. So that's the first and most obvious reason. The other reason is the fact that polls don't actually tell you what Americans think. Now, I know what this sounds like. It sounds like I'm saying... it sounds weird, right? It sounds like, But hear me out on this one. Because polls don't actually tell you what Americans think. Because most polls have a sample of 5,000 or 6,000. That is not most Americans, and so you're not going to be getting... So even if it's not American, say it's not an American poll, say it's like a Ugandan poll or something, which I don't think they exist, but let's say that they do. So say there's about, I don't know how many Ugandans there are, but say there's, I'm just going to give a number, 10 million Ugandans, and this poll is only like 15,000 of them. So you're not going to be getting, that's not all Ugandans. A poll of 10, 15, 20,000 Americans, that's not all Americans. So saying that a poll saying 71% Americans think this is inaccurate, because that's only certain Americans, the Americans they polled. So even if you do somehow equate for all of the disparities of parties and whatnot, you're still going to have this problem of you're not actually representing all Americans. And you can't really represent all Americans. It's not really possible, honestly. So there's that reason as well. The other reason is that even if you do manage to do this in some way... Okay, so let's actually not go with that one. Let's so the other problem with polls is the questions themselves can be misleading, or not even necessarily misleading, but they can be confusing, or they may not be, they may be very vague or whatever it is. So even if you deal with all these factors, the questions themselves are still very vague. And then, of course, you're dealing with the other problem of, even if you deal with all of these factors, you're not dealing with them. You're still not polling all Americans. But let's say that even if you manage to poll every single American, even if you manage to fix all of these problems, there's still one other problem. There's still a couple other problems, actually. One of them being that polls are often simplified. The questions are often too simplified. The other problem is that they don't really do anything. Honestly, they don't really show you anything that's really that important. There are some polls that do. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there isn't, but most polls are, very short-sighted in the ways they do things, and the ways, the questions they ask and whatnot. And the other problem too, as well, is that if particularly nowadays, the way that certain people are, certain groups are, even certain parties are to some extent. The pollster, the people taking the polls could be influenced. Either the person taking the poll could be influenced by the pollsters themselves, or they could be influenced by the questions themselves, or they could actually be lying because of the fact that you're too afraid to actually tell people what your actual positions are because of the ways in which people react to that, to what your position is. You've seen this a lot with some groups. I don't really want to name party names or anything like this, but you've seen this happen. You've seen this with anti-Trump people, with pro-Trump people sometimes, but mostly it seems to be the anti-Trumpers. They're so invested in their positions that they don't seem to that anybody who goes slightly against their positions, they're not going to be reasonable when you tell them the truth. So you're going to be lying. That's the other reason as well. Now, if you can somehow make the polls anonymous, which I think they are, so this may not be the case, but even if it isn't, even if it is the case, still is possible that somehow the person is found out. So there's that as well. So the polls themselves are often, they can also be used to make a point, I just lost my train of thought. But they could be used to frame something in a way that's not actually the way it is. That's the other problem with polls. And also, you're assuming that one thing, people are gonna is one thing over another. Like, say, do you believe in this or that, or do you think it's this or that? Well, what if it's neither of those things? What if it's in between those things? What if it's not, that simple? Because often things are not that simple. So that's the other problem with polls. And the other problem with polls is the fact that so many people are misled. Not because of this thing called fake news, but because of this thing called culture, of this thing called cognitive bias, and fake news too, I guess. But fake news is not. I might make a video on this, but fake news is not some new thing that exists. It's not just one side or another necessarily that does this, and it's not new. It's not as new as people would think it is. People think, oh man, this recently, fake news has really been happening recently. No, that's not really true. It's never been true. Fake news has always existed. The only reason why you haven't really noticed this is because, well, one, the internet exists. Two, there really wasn't a term to describe what was happening, the phenomenon of fake news. And three, the term is a political thing more than anything, it seems like. Which is why I don't really like using the term fake news. Because it's often more of a political stunt rather than an actual thing that happens. I mean, I'm not saying it happens. Obviously, it happens. It happens a lot, honestly. But I think it seems to be mostly a political stunt, a way of getting more political followers and whatnot. And Trump is actually a really good example of this. Not that Trump is wrong all the time on what he says about fake news, but he's overtly, I would say he's too simplified in his thinking about what fake news is. And that's the problem right there. That's the problem with polls in the first place, is that usually they're too simplified in their thinking. Often political parties are the same way. When it comes to politics, people are often too simplified in their thinking. And the reason is actually kind of interesting. It's because of the left brain. People are, I don't know, people have this idea, not even the left brain, but people have this idea that things are one way or another when it's not necessarily that simple. And it never has really been that simple, but because we have this paradigm, this idea that it has to be one way or another, or it's just one thing or another, because we have this idea that it has to be this way, we have this problem of oversimplifying things, over generalizing things because of this. Now I get doing that. Like if you are trying to make a point based on a short amount of time that you have. Like if you're trying to inform somebody about something and you only have like 5 or 6 minutes to do it, I get doing it in that situation. But even then, I would say to add something like, but it's also more complicated than this. And for more information, you can look at and that's how you can kind of overcome this problem. But I think the problem is also the mind itself is almost seems to be almost geared towards this sort of behavior. So that's the problem with polls. The polls themselves often have these problems. I did go on a little ramble there, but it is something that's odd that happens. So that's why you should take polls with a grain of salt, because you don't really know what the populace that they're using is. Even if they're overcoming that problem, there's still the problem of the influence and whatnot. So keep this in mind when you're looking at a poll and whatnot. So anyways, if you guys have any questions or comments, leave them below. This is Political Ideas and Thoughts, and I'll talk to you on the next video.